Hey everyone, welcome to what is probably our last little bonus episode about Three Body Problem. We are nearly done covering the book. We have just one more episode to go. And Opsa, you and I wanted to have one last bonus conversation
That's right.
about the Netflix adaptation, just because it's been over a month now since the show came out, and folks have had an opportunity to watch it, perhaps even rewatch it. And so we wanted to just talk about the show's reception, what critics thought of it, and perhaps even more importantly, what our listeners thought of it. We collected a bunch of your comments and your thoughts in Discord and on Patreon and via email, and we're going to share them today. So it should be fun. And then I just want to call out at the end of the episode, we are going to share a short 15-minute conversation that we had with Zach Kram, who is a podcast producer and writer over at The Ringer. He's a huge Lucian fan. He loved the Netflix show, and he wrote The Ringer's review for the Netflix show. And we actually emailed him, and he was kind enough to hop on the phone with us and chat. So at the end of this bonus episode, you'll also hear our conversation with him.
That's right. You probably saw the teaser that we released just a few weeks ago of that conversation, but we'll be sharing the full interview at the end of this episode.
That's right. Okay, let's start with critic reviews. Clue us in, Opsa. What did the critics think of Three Body Problem?
Three Body Problem is doing well on Rotten Tomatoes. As of today, we're looking at about 80% on the critic score and a little bit lower, but 78% for the audience score. So
wow.
Clearly, I mean, this show resonated with popular audiences. It's really kind of really cool to see. And for additional context, you'll see that on Rotten Tomatoes, Fallout, which also got released recently on Amazon Prime, is sitting a bit higher at 93%.
Wow.
And Halo and Foundation are also in that 80-90% range. Halo at 80% and Foundation at 86%. So
wow, yeah,
really, really interesting to see that we've got some great content coming out in the sci-fi universe right now.
We do. And it's notable because those three shows that you just called out there are from different streamers. Fallout is on Amazon, Halo is on Paramount, whatever the fuck it's on.
I think yeah.
And then Foundation, of course, is on Apple TV Plus, which is kind of becoming the destination for sci-fi adaptations.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Three Body Problem is on Netflix. So we're seeing sci-fi across the board, across the streamers. And at 80%, Three Body Problem seems to be sitting right up there with the upper echelon of the more popular shows.
Yeah, totally. We'll also note that Netflix has called out Three Body Problem a month after its release as being still the #1 watched show on the platform.
Wow.
So really, that is across genres and across content types, shows, films, etc. I take it back. #1 watched show on the platform.
That's right.
But across genres, which is really quite impressive.
That's impressive. Again, for a high concept science fiction adaptation, that's impressive, right? Like that's generally a genre that you don't see a lot of people take big swings in, right?
Oh, totally.
It's either take the established IP like the Halo or the Fallout and then rely on the IP and its popularity to convert into a show that you know will be popular. Like that's a easier gamble than taking what, of course, is a very popular book, but also popular among science fiction fans. I wouldn't say Three Body Problem is something that your average like mom book club is reading.
Right.
And so this was quite a bit of a gamble for Netflix, and to see that the gamble seems to at least be paying off as far as what Netflix is saying and how they're touting that it's the #1 show on the platform. That's impressive. That's a big achievement.
Absolutely. And it's also interesting to see just on the broader internet references to Three Body Problem in kind of unexpected places. You know, I was scrolling through a forum the other day and I saw something about I can't wait for the Trisolar Overlords to get here. And I was like, what is it?
Incredible. Yeah.
I'm looking for a barber. Why is there a reference to Three Body Problem? You know, it's so it's really quite interesting to see like how much it has pierced into the kind of popular consciousness and just the into the ethos. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. When your property, when your show, when your art starts to become memed,
right,
that is the highest form
Right.
positive feedback you can receive in the modern age.
Agreed.
If you've created something that people are now memeing left and right, you did it.
You did it.
Okay, let's now talk about what our listeners had to say. So we collected a bunch of responses from all of you in Discord, in Patreon, via email, and there are a bunch of them that we want to share and talk about today. We love doing this because, as we always say, this is a book club. Your input is super important. The show doesn't work without it. So let's get into it.
All right, well, let's start with C. Wilson in Discord. This was a great comment that we got. I don't have a long or deep thought here, but it was nice to spend time with highly competent characters who were acknowledging the problems they encountered, and the writers didn't derail us too often with goofy, my truth, etc. 2024-isms. It also reminded me of Star Trek The Next Generation, where highly competent individuals would step up to the challenge as professionals, not get hung up on emotions. And to put it mildly, the characters weren't written like sad, self-loathing, useless millennials.
Shots fired. Damn. Calling me out, C. Wilson.
I feel very seen. They follow that up, though, with, I know this sounds cynical, but those are my thoughts. I haven't read the book, but I've seen the whole season twice through now.
Wow.
Got to give them credit. I've seen it twice.
Incredible, yeah.
And they plan on reading the book sometime in the near future.
Nice. Well, hopefully they've heard about this little book club that we're doing about the book.
Oh,
maybe they can read along with us.
That would be cool.
I don't know that I fully agree with the take that these characters aren't emotional, because I think we see lots of emotion, particularly about the Will cancer situation. When Jack gets killed, there's definitely some emotional reactions. It's nice to see them all as very competent professionals taking on the challenge of aliens in like very logical ways. And especially, I would imagine Wade is somebody that C. Wilson really liked watching on screen, because Wade is out here just making shit happen, getting the Secretary of the UN on the fucking line.
Yeah, that's right.
So I would quibble a little bit with C. Wilson's thoughts here. I think there was plenty of emotion in the show, and I think the characters did have some ups and downs. But in general, I agree. It was nice to see some very smart people do some very smart things. It's always fun to watch.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, let's talk about this next comment. This one's from Nancy Whitaker on Patreon. Nancy wrote, quote, I think you guys are not giving credit to the Chinese TV version. They took the effort to humanize Wang Miao. He has a loving relationship with his wife and daughter that comes out in at least 2 of the episodes. You really feel Wang's longing to comfort his family while they act as a source of strength. There is a scene where Wang Miao goes to his daughter's school to encourage them to love science. Best scene of father-daughter bonding. May not have been in the book, but nice to see in the series. End quote.
Wow, that is good to know.
Yeah, wow.
I will say. Neither of us have seen the Chinese version yet, and that is one of the criticisms of Wang Miao, both in the book and in the Netflix adaptation, that obviously Wang Miao not present in literal form in the Netflix adaptation, but as a character, he's kind of embodied by a few different people, and there is a sort of maybe hollowness to his character, or like a lack of kind of interesting character building that kind of happens with him in particular. And it's great to know that that is something that at least one adaptation has taken the effort to remedy.
Yeah. And also justice for Wang Miao's wife and daughter, apparently in the Chinese adaptation. That's amazing.
That's right. Yeah, that definitely was one of our kind of recurring bits about the 3 of them. We never got to even know their names. Like, they basically have no identity in the books. So justice indeed.
Yeah. Thank you, Nancy, for that feedback. And honestly, like, I might check out the Chinese TV version now. I hear it's like 30 episodes. I don't know that I necessarily have the time for a 30-episode TV show, but I might check it out now.
Yeah, I certainly have it bookmarked. I think we probably won't do a full deep dive into it on this
Are you suggesting
podcast,
30 episodes? You know what?
Maybe
email
a
us.
watch party.
Email us if you want that.
If you want it, we
we'll consider it. We'll that's all we can promise.
That's right. Coming up next is Josh Slink, who's been super active in our Discord. Love to see it. And he writes, I watched the first 5 episodes after finishing the novel. I thought the first 5 episodes were fine. The show has de emphasized the aspects of the book I most enjoyed, the hard science fiction elements and the slowly unfolding mystery, and it's emphasized the aspects of the novel I felt were weakest, personal drama and the physical violence. It isn't a bad show by any means, but I really started losing interest when so many big reveals from late in the novel were presented so soon in the narrative. I may revisit after finishing the trilogy of novels, but at this point, it feels more like a popcorn feature than something for me to really engage with critically. Valid. I mean,
I don't disagree.
I don't disagree.
Totally. A lot of the science certainly de-emphasized and flattened in the TV show, which to some extent you have to give leeway, right? Because it's necessary.
Totally.
If you're expanding the audience, you need to allow the average non-sci-fi viewer and reader to be able to watch and enjoy this show without getting caught up in the astrophysics of it all.
Right.
But of course, as fans of the book, as fans of sci-fi, for us, the astrophysics of it all is oftentimes the most fun part.
Creme de la creme. Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And we talked a lot in our chats about the personal drama, the positive side of the Netflix show doing that, but also some of the pitfalls that it ran into.
Totally. Yeah, I think for me, the part of this review that most resonates is kind of the pacing of the show as compared to the novel, and the fact that so much was brought up, so many of the big reveals were brought up in. I mean, I remember after just the first episode being confused by how much of the book that we'd covered already. And by the second episode, we were somehow already like in the middle. There were like big plot reveals from what the latter half of the book. And I found that to be a little, as somebody who had read the book, of course, found that to be a little, I don't want to say disconcerting, but it was a little kind of odd. But ultimately, you have to adapt something in a way that presents a kind of interesting, compelling narrative. And sometimes that does mean you rework the narrative a little bit.
Totally. I agree on the pacing points as well. Okay, next up we have thoughts from Daniel in Discord. Shouts to Daniel as well, very active in our Discord community. And he is also a longtime listener of my other podcast, Gam Jabbar. Love to see it. Okay, Daniel said, quote, "I just finished the season. I enjoyed it. I felt that the story beats moved well, and the decision to expand the characters to a group brought emotional depth that I can see connecting with lots of people. I read the book long enough ago, and the changes were significant enough that many of the reveals and story beats were fresh for me. I found myself recollecting things, but after the fact. I am also a bit disappointed that we lose much of the hard science, but that's a really big ask in a visual medium when the only way to explore it is through straight exposition. Many of the visuals in the show were stunning and fresh, like the destruction of the tanker ship and the video game, which I wish we had seen more of. The video game was the best part for me because that was often the weakest for me when I read the novel. Having read the whole trilogy, without getting spoilery, I feel like I see the threads being laid out that will tie the broader storylines together." End quote.
Yeah, pretty right on there. I think a lot of what you said speaks to how we felt about the show and what we're hearing in some of these other reviews as well. So more of the game would have been lovely. We would have loved to have seen the human computer in kind of full action, and we got a glimpse of it, but definitely lots of the game were lost in the adaptation.
For sure. I do like that Daniel called out that we are moving from a written medium to a visual medium.
Right.
And with that translation, of course, you lose some things, you gain some things. You get to see something as awe-inspiring as the planet being torn apart in a trisolar syzygy.
Right.
In a way that maybe that chapter in the book doesn't affect you, but then you also lose what the book is able to do in 5 pages of exposition about solar radiation. You lose that dense hard sci-fi because you cannot have 30 minutes of exposition in a show of characters talking or drawing diagrams about solar radiation. I don't know about you, but I am turning that shit off.
Yeah, that's certainly true, and it certainly speaks to why the other adaptation is over 3 times as long at 30 episodes. So you can certainly capture that level of fidelity, but it's going to take a lot longer. So makes perfect sense.
For sure.
All right, and for our final comment that we want to share here, and again, we just want to plug all of the people that have chipped in and shared their thoughts. And this one comes from Matthias in Discord. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he writes, I finished the first season. I've read all 3 books and also watched the Tencent series as well as the animated series for Dark Forest. A common complaint about the books is that the characters are poorly written. I do remember hearing that Chinese literature tends to de-emphasize character building in favor of just using the characters more as plot devices in order to simply push forward the narrative as a whole. So the decision to split up characters in the Netflix version to have that extra bit of interaction and exposition makes a lot of sense with that in mind. Overall, I really liked what they did with this adaptation. It, however, feels like they could have fleshed it out with more than just 8 episodes for season 1, as it felt like a somewhat abridged version of the story, in contrast to the more fleshed out Tencent adaptation, which I have to say I more prefer. But the Netflix adaptation does serve as a great and more digestible entry level into the universe of the 3-body problem.
Really great points here. And also, animated Dark Forest series?
I was not aware of that.
Definitely tell us more about that in Discord, Matthias.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that now. Hadn't heard of that myself, but yeah, this is interesting. We have a number of folks here saying that they preferred the Chinese Tencent version of the adaptation over the Netflix adaptation. And of course, our listeners are going to skew toward people who are already huge fans of the book or are reading the book along with us. So it's tough to get the perspective of like your average Netflix watcher who doesn't even know about the book and what they perhaps thought of the series. But now I'm more and more interested in the Tencent version. Maybe we will have to check it out.
Agreed. Yeah. I appreciate this take from a super fan, though, and also the additional context that's provided about Chinese literature, perhaps just de-emphasizing character building, which is definitely has been a long-standing criticism that we and others have made about the characters in 3-Body Problem. And it's interesting to know that might be not specific to Liu Cixin.
Right. Something more cultural. That is something that I was really trying to be cognizant of on our read of the book and during our discussions. Like I was trying to remind myself that at the end of the day, I am reading a translation of a book that obviously is not representative of the culture that I grew up in, of Western culture, of American culture. And so maybe the parts where I'm like, that's awkward. Why did he say that? Or why is this character behaving like this? Or that's a weird way to deliver that line. Some of those I was trying to keep in mind, like this could just be a translation thing, right? You're never going to translate the tone perfectly from one language to another. It could also just be a cultural thing that maybe doesn't make sense to me, but for a Chinese reader reading the original book in Chinese, this would make perfect sense. So really glad that that you called that out, Opsa, and that Matthias mentioned that there is something to keep in mind here when it comes to the translation of text from one culture and from one language to another. You lose some of the original tone and depth that was perhaps there.
Absolutely. Maybe just yet another argument for watching the Tencent adaptation and seeing what it looks like to have an adaptation that's rooted in the culture that produced the work.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. Well, thank you all so much for your comments and your thoughts and for your discussions in Discord. It's been such a blast. Every time we drop a new episode, you all have things to say about it. We've been seeing new people join the Discord every single week, and it's really exciting. I can't wait to complete 3-Body, get into future books with our little community that we're building. It's so much fun.
That's right.
Now, to round out this little bonus episode, as promised, we do want to share our interview with Zach Kram from The Ringer, producer and writer at The Ringer, big fan of Liu Cixin. And we chatted with him. We sat down with Zach and we asked him about 3-Body Problem. Not just the Netflix show, but the book series as well, just to get his thoughts on what he considers to be one of his all-time favorite sci-fi series.
That's right.
So that's it for this bonus episode. We're going to hit play on that interview. Hope you enjoy it, and we will see you in the next episode. Thank you all so much for listening. All right, Zach, thank you so much for chatting with us today. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Both of us read your review of Netflix's adaptation, and we loved it, and we agreed on many points. So we wanted to get you on the horn and talk to you about Three Body because you're such a big fan. You said in the piece that you are kind of a diehard Liu Cixin fan. You love the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy. And so, just right off the bat for our listeners, I'm curious from a super fan, what do you think elevates these books from just good or even great sci fi to exceptional sci fi?
Well, I think everyone who watched the Netflix show knows how important the concept of a brain is, right? We saw a brain getting shipped out into space. And I think the way Lou's brain works is remarkable. The concepts and ideas in this story are simply unparalleled in my view in terms of I've read a lot of science fiction, and if I had to pick like the dozen coolest sci-fi concepts I've ever encountered in fiction, this series probably has half of those dozen. And I think he has weaknesses as a writer. We can get into that about maybe he's not the best at writing character or romance, or his prose isn't as pristine as some other authors, but just his ideas and concepts. And I also think that the fact that he writes, at least in this series, in a near future science fiction, everything isn't happening thousands of years into the future when humans have already conquered the galaxy. It's all happening basically now or close to now. So I think the concepts resonate a bit more. I think there's a level of connectivity and being able to almost visualize yourself in this story in a way that you can't necessarily in other science fiction.
Totally. I couldn't agree more. You actually wrote in your piece, kind of digging deeper into these ideas that are in the book. You wrote that once you discovered the series, you like tore through the trilogy, and the plots and the themes like stayed with you for months and months afterwards. So I'm curious, what are some of those like themes and ideas and high-minded questions from this trilogy that resonate with you and really make you think?
Well, I don't want to get into spoilers too much for people who haven't read the entire trilogy, but I think the general concepts of what lasts on a galactic timescale. I think Lou was maybe interviewed by the New Yorker a couple years ago and said that time adds such an interesting perspective to morals in fiction. He said, if you take a romance and say the boy and the girl ended up living happily ever after, that's a happy story, right? But if you fast forward 100 years, then they both die. And then does that make it a tragedy? And I think that concept comes into this trilogy a lot, where you might solve a problem at one point, but there's still going to be more problems years down the line. And the idea of how can we last over basically an eternity when our lives are so short really sticks with you when you finish the series. And hopefully the Netflix series will get renewed to the point that we can see those ideas really come more concretely. We obviously saw in season 1 the concept of hibernation technology introduced, and that plays an important role going forward in the books to bring these concepts to the fore.
Yeah, definitely. I really am enjoying, both in the book and in the series, how they're playing with this idea of time and like the past, right? Obviously, the Cultural Revolution is an extremely important aspect of the first book, and for Yuencia's character, and then how that sort of resonates into the present day, and then what that means for the future of humanity in 400 plus years when these potential aliens might actually make physical contact with humanity.
Yeah, the very concept that faster than light travel does not exist, and it is going to take 400 years, I think adds a layer of, okay, we have maybe time to respond to this, and how do we think about a threat to the future? We saw some of the characters in season 1 grappling with, well, it's not going to affect me, and it's not going to affect my kids, and it's not going to affect my grandkids, so why should I care? Whereas other people do care, and you can obviously see real world allegories in that with something like climate change, but I think we'll see even more of that if there's a season 2, and for readers who go on and continue the series, that humanity is not a monolith, and we would respond to a threat like this in a different way. So I think that time pressure adds to the exploration of human reaction.
Such a great point.
I think also, I mean, to the point of the characters having to grapple with these, big moral questions. I think that is maybe a bit of a divergence, between the book and the series, in that one of the main criticisms of the book is kind of how shallow some of the characters can be in comparison to these larger than life questions and the scientific ideas at play. And I think you wrote in your review that the Netflix show attempts to correct this. Do you think that was successful?
I don't think that these characters are as memorable as, for instance, Game of Thrones were, right? If you compare, because Benioff and Weiss are two of the showrunners here, and the characters that like they adapted from George R. R. Martin, Tyrion Lannister, and Arya Stark, we don't have anybody from this series on those characters' level, but I think they definitely elevated. The biggest change in season 1 was the main character of the first book, who is extremely boring in the book. He has a wife and kids who he mentions at one point and never appear again. And
that's right.
Exactly. He just scares them in one scene and then never thinks about them again. So
right.
I think there was a lot of room for improvement there, and they succeeded in that respect. The more compelling main characters, I think, is one, and I think she was adapted very well. And then the characters
Absolutely.
from books 2 and 3 who were pulled forward into book 1 here. And on the one hand, it might not necessarily be as realistic to have like the most important characters in this globe spanning story to all have known each other before the story actually begins, right? So I think that's a reason that they didn't in the book, because Lou is so concerned with that realistic aspect. But on the other hand, for a TV show, when we want to connect to characters, it probably made a little more sense to write it that way.
Yeah, and it gave them the opportunity to build those interpersonal relationships in the TV show, like the cancer plot line, without getting into spoilery details. Like, there were some emotionally heavy moments that genuinely got me in a way that I think the book never necessarily made me tear up.
Yeah, the cancer plot specifically, I think, is rendered a lot better here. I was talking to one of my bosses at The Ringer who had only read the first book before she began watching the show, and she was like, "Oh, the cancer, that relationship was one of her favorites in the entire season." And I said, "Yeah, it doesn't really ever hit those beats in the book. It's kind of more a plot device to get the ball rolling as opposed to something meaningful in and of itself."
I guess so that pulling of some of the plot elements from subsequent books, that maybe is a little confusing for readers of just the first book. Do you think that was a kind of a wise choice, like a smart device, in trying to move the plot forward a little bit and tease maybe a second season?
Well, if it helps them get a second season, I'd love it. But
Yeah.
but really, I think given that the first book is the shortest of the 3 and almost like a prequel in some respects, where at the end of the first book, you learn, okay, we are bugs. The aliens will be here in 400 years. How do we respond? That's almost setting up what do we do now? And I think, like I mentioned earlier, those half dozen super cool concepts, most of those come from books 2 and 3. So if they want to fast forward through the scene setting a little bit, I think it makes a little more sense. Even the way they ended season 1 with the introduction of the Wallfacer project. In the books, you have to wait maybe 100 pages into book 2 to learn what is going on there. But here it works, I think, really effectively as a cliffhanger. I was having a conversation with somebody who said, okay, if you were a Wallfacer, or if I were a Wallfacer in real life, how would I respond to this? So I think there are some interesting ways that it sets up being able to put yourself in those shoes and connect with the character in that position.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the show was very effective in doing that, because I really found myself pondering that same exact question. If I was Saul and was given this directive to be a Wallfacer, how would I react? And I think many of us think, like, I guess I'd rise to the occasion and I'd win. And I think the reality is most of us would be in denial, like Saul in the TV show.
That's overly confident. I would say I have absolutely no idea how to beat aliens. I would be exactly like him. This is not my responsibility.
Fair point.
Yeah.
So from your review, it seems like you really enjoyed the TV show, and you even went so far as to say that many aspects of the book, the show improved upon. I am curious, do you have any critiques for the show, though? Anything that you felt was missing, or things that fell short for you that you had hoped to see in season 1?
Yeah, I think anytime you're going to get a heavy, hard science fiction adaptation to make it more palatable for a general audience. Some of that science is going to be lost in translation. And when I enjoy the science fiction largely for the science, there are, of course, some aspects of that. So I think one thing that Lou does really well in the books is have metaphors to explain his concepts from a big level, like the human computer in the three-body problem game, to individual scenes. Like, I really wish the show had adapted the billiards table scene where they're carrying the billiards table around the room and saying, okay, the experiment should be the same every time, but when we're playing with our Large Hadron Collider, it's not. And I thought that was a really effective metaphor earlier in the book. Or something like at the end of book 1, when they learn about the Sophon lock on science and are talking about why it matters. And one character says something like, well, if you go to war against somebody with a nuclear bomb and your technology is stuck on the level of swords and crossbows, you can make the very best crossbow in the world, you're still not going to win. And I thought something like that would be a really effective metaphor to explain in practice how this lock on deep theoretical science manifests. Did audiences who didn't read the book understand that? Probably, but I think it would have been a little bit more effective and powerful to include some of those more metaphors in the show.
Completely. I was talking to a friend about it this past weekend after finishing the show, but I got the sense that the Sophons were a tad overpowered in the show, maybe. Like, if I thought too hard about it, I was like, why can't they just crash the plane Saul's on here and just kill him anyway? It seems like they can just like control any technology on the planet, whereas in the book, it's a little more clear that the Sophons are more like an interference method and not like a thing where they can just hack into any computer system.
Yeah, he mentions several times in the book, like, they can't actually touch or affect anything. They're just tiny, right? And even when they unfold, it's more like an illusion rather than something that can rattle a plane engine.
Yeah. So we don't want to take up too much more of your time. You have given us a lot to ponder here. Thank you so much, Zach. Something we like to ask all of our guests, though, is we are huge science fiction nerds, even beyond the three-body problem. And it sounds like you are a big science fiction reader and consumer as well. So I'm curious, what are some of your all-time favorite sci-fi stories out there? Books, movies, TV shows, whatever they may be.
So honestly, Three-Body Problem probably is my favorite science fiction series. But
nice.
I think The Expanse is also up there, both the book series and TV shows. The way that series really elevates with every book, and there are 9 of them, so it's a lot. I think it's just extraordinarily impressive.
Yeah.
I interviewed those authors for a story I wrote about the last Expanse book that came out, and they mentioned to me that when they've talked to readers, they get readers who will point to all 9 of those books as their favorite in the series.
Wow.
And I think that's pretty remarkable when, with most series, we can point to, like, nobody thinks that Chamber of Secrets is the best Harry Potter book, probably, right? We all have like the 2 or 3 Harry Potter books, or, the 1 or 2 Dune books that everyone considers the best.
Yeah.
But the Expanse series, you could realistically point to every single one of them. And I think that would probably be up there with Three-Body Problem as my favorites. I think the other one that comes to mind off the top of my head is A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine.
Yes.
Is a duology that, like, in terms of intricate world building, is some of the best I've ever seen. So if listeners haven't read that one yet, I would highly recommend it. Very different from the kinds of stories we've been talking about, but in terms of immersing you in a fictional but realistic seeming but also alien world, it's just top tier.
Yeah, I actually read that on audiobook last year, and I've been meaning to just revisit in physical because it was like a little hard to follow in audio.
Yes.
Because it's so dense.
Yeah, it took a little bit to get into, and then I just tore through it, and then I finished the second book, and I was like, all right, when does the third come out? And then found out it was only a duology, and was really disappointed because I wanted to keep living in that world a while longer.
Yeah, it was a really stunning world building for sure. All right, Zach, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for inviting all of the Chamber of Secrets people to blast us with 1-star reviews. No, there's only like 12 Chamber of Secrets stands out there. They know who they are. But what a pleasure to talk to someone who's such a big fan of this. And thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you so much for having me.